Today, we're ranking every major assault gun of World War II, from the slow steel boxes that barely survived the battlefield to the armored killers that changed mechanized warfare forever. C tier, worst tier. 10. Stug I, Germany, 1940. Every legend has a rough draft. The Stug I was Germany's. Picture 1940. Erich von Manstein is pitching his radical armored doctrine, and the Wehrmacht needs a low-profile armored infantry support vehicle fast, so they bolt a short 75mm howitzer onto a Panzer I chassis. Simple, right? Except the Panzer I chassis was barely enough to carry 2 men with rifles. Now you're asking it to carry a howitzer, a crew of 4, and go to war. The suspension groaned, the engine overheated, and the gun, a 75mm Stug XVIII, had all the armor-piercing ambition of a polite complaint. It saw limited combat in France and was quietly shelved. Germany looked at it, learned exactly one lesson: bigger, and moved on. It earns the last spot not out of cruelty, but because of what it represents: the price of figuring things out in real time. 9. Semovente M40-75/18, Italy, 1941. Now here's where things get genuinely sad. The Italians, working with budgets that would make a local council wince, took their M13/40 tank chassis, stripped the turret, and mounted a 75mm mountain howitzer on it. On paper, elegant, a compact assault gun for North African terrain. In reality, the M40 was a machine perpetually fighting itself. The chassis was plagued with mechanical unreliability. The armor, 30mm at best, was enough to stop rifle fire and not much else. And the 75mm gun, while decent against soft targets and fortifications, couldn't reliably handle Allied armor past close range. But here's what keeps it off the very bottom. Italian crews were, by all accounts, extraordinarily brave. They made this thing work in situations where better-equipped men might have retreated. There are accounts from North Africa of M40 crews engaging British Matildas at suicidal range simply because they had no other option. The machine failed them. They didn't fail the machine. 8. Su-76 I, Soviet Union, 1943. The Soviets had a unique philosophy about captured enemy equipment. If it rolls and it shoots, it works for us now. The Su-76 I was born from captured German Panzer III and Stug III holes. Soviet engineers cut open the top, welded in a 76mm gun, and sent it to the Eastern Front. Sounds resourceful. And it was, right up until the point where it wasn't. The problem wasn't the gun. The 76mm Zis-5 was a solid weapon. The problem was parts. Every Su-76I that broke down, and they broke down constantly, required German spare parts that the Soviets simply didn't have in reliable supply. Maintenance became a nightmare. Crews called it a headache on tracks. By mid-1943, production quietly ended. The Soviets, nothing if not efficient, decided their time was better spent on machines they could actually fix. It's ranked here because good intentions and a decent gun don't save you when your supply chain is working against you. B tier, the competent disappointments. 7. Alecto, Britain, 1942-45. Britain had a complicated relationship with the assault gun concept. They understood it intellectually. Execution was another matter. The Alecto was built on the Harry Hopkins light tank chassis, itself a machine nobody was particularly proud of, and fitted with a QF 95mm howitzer. It was designed as a close support weapon for airborne and light infantry units. And in that specific, very narrow role, it was adequate. Not inspiring, not terrifying to the enemy. Adequate. The real problem was timing. By the time it was ready for production in any meaningful number, the war in Europe was reaching its final chapter. It never saw serious combat. The crews who trained on it never got to find out if it was actually as mediocre as it looked on paper. History gave the Alecto no real chance to prove itself, and that, ironically, might be the kindest thing history ever did for it. 6. Sov-76, Soviet Union, 1942. The Su-76 is one of those weapons that gets harder to judge the more you know about it. On paper, it looks weak, a 76mm gun on a light chassis, open-topped, thin armor. Crews hated the early versions so much, the parallel engine arrangement caused catastrophic vibration that Stalin personally intervened to demand redesigns. They called it StuH, Russian for something we won't say on this channel, but the word rhymes with what the crews thought of it. The redesigned Su-76M, though, that machine found its lane. Not as a tank killer, not as a frontal assault weapon, as direct infantry fire support, where its lightweight let it go places heavier Soviet vehicles couldn't, where its 76mm gun was more than enough to obliterate machine gun nests, bunkers, and light vehicles. By 1944, it was the second most produced Soviet armored vehicle of the entire war. It's ranked 6th because it's the story of a bad machine becoming a useful one, once the Army stopped asking it to be something it wasn't. A tier, the solid performers. 5. Sturmhaubitze 42, StuH 42, Germany, 1942. If the Stug III was the Swiss Army knife of the German arsenal, the StuH 42 was the one you grabbed when you needed to demolish something. Same hull, same chassis, same low silhouette. But instead of the high-velocity anti-tank gun, the StuH 42 carried a 105mm howitzer. A weapon designed not to penetrate armor, but to erase fortifications, trench lines, and anything hiding behind a wall. Wehrmacht infantry units loved it. It was the kind of support vehicle that could turn a stalled urban assault into a breakthrough. You pointed at a building, the building stops being a problem. Its limitation was the obvious one. Against later Allied and Soviet armor, the 105mm howitzer with heat rounds could manage, but it was never the weapon you wanted in a straight armor duel. It was a support gun asked, occasionally, to be a tank destroyer. But in its intended role, it was devastating, efficient, and it had the good sense to stay in that role most of the time. 4. ISU-122, Soviet Union, 1944. By 1943, the Soviets had a very specific problem. They were running into Tiger tanks and Panther tanks, and they needed something that could reach out and end the conversation before it started. The ISU-122 was that answer. Built on the IS-1 heavy tank chassis, already a beast, the Soviets mounted a 122mm naval gun, not an artillery piece adapted for armor, a naval gun. The A-19 could penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor from over a kilometer away. And that was its genius. It didn't need to get close. Crews could sit at range, identify a threat, and deal with it before the threat even knew they were there. The downsides were real. The gun had a slow reload, about 3 rounds per minute, which in a fluid engagement felt like an eternity. The crew compartment was cramped, and the gun manlet had a shot trap that could, under specific unlucky circumstances, deflect rounds down into the hull. But here's the thing about the ISU-122 that earns its place this high. It made German tankers nervous, and by 1944, that was no small achievement. S tier, the legends. 3. Hetzer, Jagdpanzer 38, Germany, 1944. There's an argument, a serious one, that the Hetzer was the most efficient piece of armor Germany produced in the entire war. Not the most powerful, efficient. Here's the context. 1944, Germany is hemorrhaging resources. Steel is rationed. Factories are being bombed. Skilled labor is disappearing. In this environment, someone had the wisdom to take the obsolete Czech Panzer 38T chassis and build something new on it. The Hetzer, and yes, the name meant baiter or agitator, weighed 16 tons, barely. Its frontal armor was angled at 60 degrees, making that thin plate perform like armor twice as thick. And it carried a 75mm POC 39 gun with genuine anti-tank capability against everything except the heaviest Allied armor. It was small enough to hide behind a haystack, literally. Crews used this. There are after-action reports of Hetzers ambushing Soviet armored columns from concealed positions that larger vehicles couldn't physically access. Its weakness was the remote-controlled machine gun, almost useless, and the cramped interior that made the crew miserable on long operations. But 33 Hetzers were still in Czech Army service into the 1970s. When a vehicle design outlasts the war that created it by 25 years, you stop arguing about its flaws. 2. ISU-152, Soviet Union, 1943. The Germans called it Dosenöffner, the can opener. The ISU-152 was Soviet engineering philosophy distilled into its purest form. If the problem is a Tiger tank, the solution is a 152mm howitzer on tracks. Not subtle, not elegant, profoundly, beautifully, terrifyingly effective. This machine entered combat at the Battle of Kursk in July 1943, the largest tank battle in history, and crews discovered almost immediately that a 152mm high-explosive round hitting a Tiger, even without penetrating the armor, could blast the turret clean off through sheer concussive force. They weren't even aiming for weak spots, they were just hitting things. The ISU-152 could also destroy field fortifications, bunkers, and buildings in a way that most armored vehicles couldn't approach. It was the Soviet Army's all-purpose instrument of destruction. Yes, the reload was slow, 2 rounds per minute on a good day. Yes, the gun had limited traverse. Yes, the crew of 5 was operating in conditions best described as industrially uncomfortable. But crews volunteered for ISU-152 units. Volunteered. In a Red Army that didn't often offer choices, soldiers chose this machine. That tells you everything. 1. Stug III Ausführung G, Germany, 1942–45. Here's the number most people won't argue with, and some will still fight about at 2 a.m. in history forums across the internet. The Stug III Ausführung G, the definitive version of a vehicle that started as an infantry support gun in 1940 and ended the war as Germany's single most effective tank destroyer. Let's start with the numbers, because they're genuinely staggering. Stug III variants destroyed more enemy armored vehicles than any other German weapon system in the entire war. More than the Panther, more than the Tiger, more than all of them. Estimates suggest over 20,000 enemy vehicles knocked out across all variants. How? Because someone made all the right compromises in all the right places. The Stug III sat low, so low that in vegetation or behind cover it essentially disappeared. The AUSF-G's long 75mm gun, the StuH 40 L48, could penetrate a T-34 at 1,000 meters. It was fast enough to reposition, cheap enough to build in massive numbers, and it had sloped armor that punched above its weight class. Crew survivability was remarkable for German armor of the period. The vehicle was mechanically reliable, built on the Panzer III chassis, well understood by mechanics. And perhaps most importantly, Stug crews developed a doctrine. They fought in teams, they chose ground, they didn't duel, they ambushed, they supported, they repositioned. By 1944, Germany was producing more Stugs than any other armored vehicle. Not because tanks were unavailable, but because commanders at the front were actively requesting Stugs. When the men who have to die inside it are choosing this one, that's your winner. The Stug III AUSF-G isn't the most powerful assault gun of World War II. It's something more useful than that. It's the most complete one. A weapon that understood exactly what it was and was exactly that, better than anything else on the battlefield.
If you liked this video, I'm sure you'll like this one too. Subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Our channel is small, so we are replying every comment below. Comment any suggestion for future videos. Thanks for watching.